This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's ChangeMaker is Griffin Hagle, the Executive Director of Alaska's TNHA, which manages affordable housing in the 8 villages of the Arctic Slope region. The TNHA serves an area that stretches more than 600 miles and is one of 14 regional housing authorities in Alaska and the northernmost public housing entity in the United States. Griffin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Katie. Great to be here.
Let's just first start with how you ended up in Alaska.
Oh, it's a great story, actually. I was living in San Diego at the time. I'm from Oregon originally, but I met the woman who I'd marry there, and on our first date, she spoke to me about this place she had lived as a kid called Barrow, Alaska, kind of an obscure place at the top of the continent. And I happened to know where it was because I was a trivia buff, and I knew that Will Rogers and Wiley Post had met their untimely end in a plane crash there in 1935. So I think that put me on the map with her. And then we ended up moving up there a couple of years later when she got her teaching credential and decided she wanted to return and give back to through the field of education there. And so I kind of signed up for the adventure. That was 2015 that we moved up and got into the housing business up there.
You're the first person we've talked to on this podcast series from Alaska, so we are very honored to hear what you're doing up there and, go through a series of having you bring the affordable housing path. But first, I also want to ask, how exactly did you end up at the Housing Authority?
Yeah, so I'm an energy efficiency geek at heart, and I got into this industry. I like to say I came to housing through a crawl space, on my hands and knees. I was pumping insulation into low-income homes back in 2006 and 7, and so really, started to get an appreciation for the opportunities to improve the built environment. And then I'd heard about this housing authority and some of the stuff going on in Alaska. And like you, before I moved up here, I really had no idea what to expect, what it looked like. It was just a big, I knew it was big, cold, and dark. It just completely surpassed my expectations. So we moved up there, and I think the first week I was there, I walked down to the Housing Authority and offered to volunteer to help them with any energy efficiency audits or any other tasks they had going on. Ended up getting to know some of the folks there, and I went to work for the local municipality for the next 3 years and change. But when the executive director position opened up in 2018, I applied and just been so fortunate to have been there since.
I love hearing about everybody's on-ramp to Housing Authority and to the industries and, whether that's development partners or nonprofits. But I really like hearing, the crawl space. I don't think we've had somebody with such a unique hands-on on-ramp here. So that is absolutely great to hear. Speaking of Alaska, obviously your region is completely different. What are some of the housing needs that may be different in your particular region than other lower 48 states?
Wow, that's a great question, Katie, and we could probably spend hours getting into just the main ways Alaska is different, and then that public and Indian country housing are different. But it has really, I've been here going on 7 years, and there's just so much to learn, and it's really hard to put it all in context without bringing somebody up here. So I'm just going to say, if you haven't been, this is officially my invitation to host you here if you ever make it up. It'd be a wonderful trip. But as far as the needs and what they look like here, especially at this moment in time, I think there's a lot of similarities in terms of the affordability crisis, just the availability of housing. But in Alaska, things are complicated by these very, very difficult logistical challenges. The housing authority I work for, we're on the north slope of Alaska, which is like the northern 15% of the state or so. It's basically a borough, a county, essentially, the size of Minnesota. So, the boundaries are 600 miles from east to west, from the Bering Sea to the Canadian border. the Chukchi Sea to the Canadian border, and about 200 miles from the Arctic Ocean coast down to the foothills, the Brooks Range. So a very large area, like Minnesota, but unlike Minnesota, no roads in or out. And so everything comes in on an airplane or on a boat, on a barge in the summertime. And that means it's very cost intensive to do a lot of things. So you've got a lot of households that are cost burdened. It's also a very difficult climate. It's probably the coldest climate in the United States. It's hard on buildings, and so there's a big renovation need and rehabilitation need. There's many homes throughout the state, especially in the tribal areas of the state, that lack complete kitchens or plumbing. That's a huge thing that always shows up in census data. In fact, there's over 12,000 homes that lack that access, and that certainly exists in our area, in the rural villages as well. Overcrowding is a term that comes up a lot in Alaska, and the state has published housing needs assessments, every few years. And what overcrowding has really been recognized for in the last few years is a manifestation of homelessness in rural Alaska. But we have such tight-knit communities, such warm cultures. Everybody knows everybody that, in the rural, especially the harsh, remote parts of the state, you're not going to see people camped out on street corners or anything like that. Mm-hmm. You'll see kind of like couch surfing with relatives, but you may have 18 or 20 people stacked up in a 3-bedroom home with one bath or even an incomplete, bath, no running water. Those sort of situations are not uncommon, unfortunately. And so, overcrowding is kind of a dry term, but when we think about it in terms of a rural homelessness crisis, it's much easier to grasp, I think.
These are very unique needs that we really don't see in the lower 48. When you mentioned, villages or boroughs that aren't close to each other, that may be hundreds of miles, from your offices or from each other or from social service providers. How exactly are you guys overcoming that issue as an organization?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think one of the things that we're one of 14 regional housing authorities in the state. One of the things that we do well, and all the other ones do well, by necessity, is we're extremely resourceful. We tend to think in longer timelines. When we're planning construction activity, there's no Home Depot to run down the street to. Ordering things from over 700 miles away. So we have to think in 6 to 8 to 12 months development cycles when we're servicing home buyer needs in rural villages. And we've got villages that could be 200 to 300 miles away from our central office in Barrow, or the city of Utkavik, as it's been known the last 5 years. We have to plan things. You have to plan mobilizations very carefully. We plan our inspections and sort of these batches where, we get our housing inspector, a few program specialists on a plane, and they'll go out, and they'll do a dozen inspections and kind of program checks with people. So everything is very tightly planned for maximum economy around, these economies of scale, I guess you would say. And so that, it's still very difficult, and it's Alaska, so weather always complicates things. Sometimes the flight doesn't get in, sometimes you don't get on it, and you plan for months down the road, and that's to say nothing of the coronavirus pandemic and how that's complicated things. But yeah, it is very challenging, and I'd say the response is to really think ahead, really plan carefully and use economies of scale.
I'm going to ask this question, and I probably know the answer to this, but your flying inspectors, that's probably not accommodated in your fee structure when it comes from HUD, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it is something that we built into our Indian housing plan, and that's something we could certainly talk more about, is the the approach to Indian housing through NAHA's, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. But yeah, we get creative with we absorb certain costs and what costs we pass on to our home buyers and our residents. And when we do these things, we fly out to send an inspector out there. We will try to take on as much as we can to keep services affordable.
Let's mention that because I believe that a couple months ago you noted and you did an analysis that, HUD's budget has grown from the low 20s to, 56 billion in the last couple of decades here. And with that expansion, there hasn't been a correlation to come about for, the Native American housing assistance. You're talking about costs here that are exaggerated for you to do business, but yet, the increase in the budget hasn't come to be recognized. What is the ramifications of that for you as an agency?
Boy, it's the ramifications are that we are doing more and more, meeting greater and greater demand, a demand that's, reached crisis levels with less and less. And I want to back up here a little bit and say that, this issue has really, I didn't, before I took on this job, I didn't have an affordable housing background per se. I came from the technical side and, the energy side. And I'm not a tribal member, not a member of a Native American community. And so I come as a bit of an outsider to Alaska and to Indian country. And just looking at what, tribal agencies and housing authorities have had to deal with, it's plain to see that there has been this chronic and systemic underinvestment. And so this position and my tenure here has really opened my eyes to that. And I mentioned in the article that I co-wrote with Colleen Dushkin, our Association of Alaska Housing Authorities Executive Director, that if you go and you want to see the effects of inflation versus this chronic underfunding, you can go and look at almost any rural community in the state, and you will see like I use the example of Breivik Mission, a village in the Bering Straits region, where you have 20 homes built by the housing authority there in the 90s. And then 10 years later, into the 2000s, they did another development run, with 10 more homes. And so that number of new units is already, cut in half, right? And then this newest subdivision, might be 5 homes around a little, and so, a lot of people could make some really fancy charts and visualizations of that. But I think there's no better than visualization than, flying into one of these villages, looking at it from above, and you can just see the effect of that inflation mounting with less and less development, less resource to accomplish that development over time.
And we're talking about less resources, not just in the example that we mentioned about inspectors flying, but, you mentioned infrastructure, the ability to create new housing with development and renovation. There's just this ripple effect, not just organizationally, but then, your ability to deliver services or, heaven forbid, like expansion of services, right? These are real unique challenges specific to you guys at a time when this underinvestment is happening. What are the options for you guys?
Well, one of the options is that we consistently, focus on our advocacy of what, what it takes to develop housing here, why housing is so important. I think all of the housing authorities, the regional housing authorities in Alaska, are already so innovative. They're so resourceful. They're building the most energy efficient structures. All of them meet or exceed the state's building and energy efficiency standards. They're running innovative programs. They know their communities. They know how to reach them and serve them. And so I think the option then turns to, and what other option do we have, but educating policymakers, educating Congress and appropriators on why NHASDA is such an essential tool. And I've had some residents in our area who are kind of cynical. I have one friend actually who grew from childhood to adulthood, on a wait list for housing, and never got in. And he said, to me, Griff, what NHASDA stands for, right? And I said, what? He said, never any housing available, so don't ask.
Oh my gosh.
That is like, boy, that's a pretty piercing insight. And things a little bit, if you work in affordable housing in Indian country. But it reflects reality, that you mentioned. While HUD's budget has overall, grown and had a 25% real expansion in its purchasing power, Indian country has lost out, with 30% of the block grant from NAHASDA losing its purchasing power over that period. So, and the other thing I think a lot of folks might miss is that NAHASDA is really this unicorn of a policy success. It is flexible. It's the S and the D at the heart of that legislation, the self-determination, are the critical principle there. So it allows tribes and allows the housing authorities to serve them to set their own priorities, to have this local or regional community input process and decide, how many units of development they want to do, how many units of rehabilitation or elder housing or veterans housing or whatever it may be. There's that flexibility built in to the structure. And so, there is this perception that it hasn't been this success over the 25 years. In October just marked 25 years of history with NAHASDA, that people have that it hasn't been successful. But the reality is that it's really this fantastic show horse that just has been starved by Congress. So there's a big opportunity there, I think, in education and advocacy to make sure people understand that this great tool for investment in our communities has been there for 25 years, and it just needs to be taken up and implemented.
So for our listeners, we're talking about NAHASDA, the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. And you just walked through what exactly self-determination means for affordable housing. And I know you've got some innovative examples where it has worked and where you have accomplished a couple things in that spirit of creativity and innovation here. Highlight one or two of those for us.
Yeah, so we're right now we're about halfway through a 3-year rehabilitation of the largest affordable housing complex in the Arctic Slope region, which is a property that we own. And we're working in conjunction with a local tribe, the native village of Barrow. So we have matched our NAHASDA funding to several other grants. We pulled in 5 or so different sources into our funding stack. It's been a great success. It's actually turned into a bit of a pandemic project for us. If we didn't have that going on, things would have been a lot more difficult because we weren't traveling out to our outlying villages as much and so forth. So we've been renovating this building built in 1977. Hasn't seen a lot of updates since then. Putting in fresh air devices for our occupants, electrifying the units, removing the fossil gas connections in the stoves and giving them, electric induction ranges, and, just going through scrubbing, cleaning up the floor coverings. And, there's some programs out there that you would really have to go through item by item, and kind of navigate the maze of what measures you're using to qualify for it. And NAHASDA, again, that flexibility, and it's by far the largest contribution towards this project is from our NAHASDA funds. It has allowed us the flexibility to do those measures, and so another example is there's a new program under NAHASDA that's a competitive block grant that was stood up in 2018. There has been some controversy about how this program kind of does an end run around the principles of NAHASDA because it is a competitive application. Tribes and housing authorities face this really arduous process to get the funds. It was kind of slow getting stood up and out the door. And we're a beneficiary of some of those funds. We were awarded a grant back in April. You kind of see this backslide happening on the promise and the potential of NAHASDA, where you have the government again setting the priorities. It's like, okay, in this competitive program, the emphasis is really on new construction, which is great, but not every tribe or every region, every housing authority has the same set of priorities. Some may want to do weatherization and rehab or other things, and so having there's always this kind of tendency, I think, with the federal bureaucracy to set some priorities, and our position is just that the flexibility of NHASDA gives us the best ways to serve our communities.
That's great. Well, hang on, Griffin. We have to take a break, but coming up in the second part of my chat with Griffin Hagle, the Executive Director of Alaska's TNHA, Griffin shares how many affordable housing units his team would need to develop to be able to fill the need.
It's at least 500 units in our region to relieve the overcrowding rate that we have.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.